laughing a little and ruffling Hazel's golden curls with her slender fingers. It was quite easy to be fond of Hazel. Hazel had been pouring out her soul to Anne in the tower room, from which they could see a young moon hanging over the harbor, and the twilight of a late May evening filling the crimson cups of the tulips below the windows. "Don't let's have any light yet," Hazel had begged, and Anne had responded, "No, it's lovely here when the dark is your friend, isn't it? When you turn on the light and it makes the dark your enemy, and it glowers in you resentfully." "I can think things like that, but I can never express them so beautifully," moaned Hazel in an anguish of rapture. "You talk in the language of violets, Miss Shirley." Hazel couldn't have explained in the least what she meant by that, but it didn't matter. It sounded so poetic. The tower room was the only peaceful room in the house. Rebecca Dew had said that morning with a hunted look, "We must get the parlor and spare room papered before the Ladies' Aid meets here," and had forthwith removed all the furniture from both to make way for a paper-hanger, who then refused to come until the next day. Windy Poplars was a wilderness of confusion, with one sole oasis in the tower room. Hazel Marr had a notorious crush on Anne. The Marrs were newcomers in Summerside, having moved there from Charlottetown during the winter. Hazel was an October blonde, as she liked to describe herself, with hair of golden bronze and brown eyes, and, so Rebecca Dew declared, had never been much good in the world since she found out she was pretty. But Hazel was popular, especially among the boys, who found her eyes and curls a quite irresistible combination. Anne liked her. Earlier in the evening she had been tired and a trifle pessimistic, with the fag that comes with late afternoon in a schoolroom, but she felt rested now, whether as a result of the May breeze, sweet with apple blossom, blowing in at the window, or of Hazel's chatter, she could not have told. Perhaps both. Somehow, to Anne, Hazel recalled her own early youth, with all its raptures and ideals and romantic visions. Hazel caught Anne's hand and pressed her lips to it reverently. "I hate all the people you have loved before me, Miss Shirley. I hate all the other people you love now. I want to possess you exclusively." "Aren't you a bit unreasonable, honey? You love other people besides me. How about Terry, for example?" "Oh, Miss Shirley, it's that I want to talk to you about. I can't endure it in silence any longer. I cannot. I must talk to someone about it, someone who understands. I went out the night before last and walked round and round the pond all night. Well, nearly. Till 12, anyhow. I've suffered everything. Everything." Hazel looked as tragic as a round, pink and white face, long-lashed eyes, and a halo of curls would let her. "Why, Hazel, dear, I thought you and Terry were so happy that everything was settled." Anne could not be blamed for thinking so. During the preceding 3 weeks, Hazel had raved to her about Terry Garland, for Hazel's attitude was, what was the use of having a beau if you couldn't talk to someone about him? "Everybody thinks that," retorted Hazel with great bitterness. "Oh, Miss Shirley, life seems so full of perplexing problems. I feel sometimes as if I wanted to lie down somewhere, anywhere, and fold my hands and never think again." "My dear girl, what has gone wrong?" "Nothing, and everything. Oh, Miss Shirley, can I tell you all about it? Can I pour out my whole soul to you?" "Of course, dear." "I have really no place to pour out my soul," said Hazel pathetically, "except in my journal, of course. Will you let me show you my journal some day, Miss Shirley? It's a self-revelation, and yet I cannot write out what burns in my soul. It stifles me." Hazel clutched dramatically at her throat. "Of course I'd like to see it, if you want me to. But what is this trouble between you and Terry?" "Oh, Terry! Miss Shirley, will you believe me when I tell you that Terry seems like a stranger to me? A stranger. Someone I'd never seen before," added Hazel, so that there might be no mistake. "But, Hazel, I thought you loved him. You said—" "Oh, I know. I thought I loved him, too, but now I know it was all a terrible mistake. Oh, Miss Shirley, you can't dream how difficult my life is, how impossible." "I know something about it," said Anne sympathetically, remembering Roy Gardner. "Oh, Miss Shirley, I'm sure I don't love him enough to marry him. I realize that now that it is too late. I was just moonlighted into thinking I loved him. If it hadn't been for the moon, I'm sure I would have asked for time to think it over, but I was swept off my feet. I can see that now. Oh, I'll run away. I'll do something desperate." "But, Hazel, dear, if you feel you've made a mistake, why not just tell him?" "Oh, Miss Shirley, I couldn't. It would kill him. He simply adores me. There isn't any way out of it, really. And Terry's beginning to talk of getting married. Think of it. A child like me. I'm only 18. All my friends I've told about my engagement as a secret are congratulating me, and it's such a farce. They think Terry is a great catch because he comes into $10,000 when he is 25. His grandmother left it to him, as if I cared about such a sordid thing as money. Oh, Miss Shirley, why is it such a mercenary world? Why?" "I suppose it is mercenary in some respects, but not in all, Hazel. And if you feel like this about Terry, we all make mistakes. It's very hard to know our minds sometimes." "Oh, isn't it? I knew you'd understand. I did think I cared for him, Miss Shirley. The first time I saw him, I just sat and gazed at him the whole evening. Waves went over me when I met his eyes. He was so handsome, though I thought even then that his hair was too curly and his eyelashes too white. That should have warned me, but I always put my soul into everything, you know. I'm so intense. I felt little shivers of ecstasy when he came near me, and now I feel nothing. Nothing. Oh, I've grown old these past few weeks, Miss Shirley. Old. I've hardly eaten anything since I got engaged. Mother could tell you. I'm sure I don't love him enough to marry him. Whatever else I may be in doubt about, I know that." "Then you shouldn't." "Even that moonlight night he proposed to me, I was thinking of what dress I'd wear to Joan Pringle's fancy dress party. I thought it would be lovely to go as Queen of the May in pale green, with a sash of darker green and a cluster of pale pink roses in my hair, and a maypole decked with tiny roses and hung with pink and green ribbons. Wouldn't it have been fetching? And then Joan's uncle had to go and die, and Joan couldn't have the party after all, so it all went for nothing. But the point is, I really couldn't have loved him when my thoughts were wandering like that, could I?" "I don't know. Our thoughts play us curious tricks sometimes." "I really don't think I ever want to get married at all, Miss Shirley. Do you happen to have an orange wood stick handy?" "Thanks. My half-moons are getting ragged. I might as well do them while I'm talking. Isn't it just lovely to be exchanging confidences like this? It's so seldom one gets the opportunity. The world intrudes itself so. Well, what was I talking of? Oh, yes, Terry. What am I to do, Miss Shirley? I want your advice. Oh, I feel like a trapped creature." "But, Hazel, it's so very simple." "Oh, it isn't simple at all, Miss Shirley. It's dreadfully complicated. Mamma is so outrageously pleased, but Aunt Jean isn't. She doesn't like Terry, and everybody says she has such good judgment. I don't want to marry anybody. I'm ambitious. I want a career. Sometimes I think I'd like to be a nun. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be the bride of heaven? I think the Catholic Church is so picturesque, don't you? But of course I'm not a Catholic. And anyway, I suppose you could hardly call it a career. I've always felt I'd love to be a nurse. It's such a romantic profession, don't you think? Smoothing fevered brows and all that. And some handsome millionaire patient falling in love with you and carrying you off to spend a honeymoon in a villa on the Riviera, facing the morning sun and the blue Mediterranean. I've seen myself in it. Foolish dreams, perhaps, but oh, so sweet. I can't give them up for the prosaic reality of marrying Terry Garland and settling down in Summerside." Hazel shivered at the very idea, and scrutinized a half-moon critically. "I suppose," began Anne.
"We haven't anything in common, you know, Miss Shirley. He doesn't care for poetry and romance, and they're my very life. Sometimes I think I must be a reincarnation of Cleopatra. Or would it be Helen of Troy? One of those languorous, seductive creatures, anyhow. I have such wonderful thoughts and feelings. I don't know where I get them, if that isn't the explanation. And Terry is so terribly matter-of-fact. He can't be a reincarnation of anybody. What he said when I told him about Vera Fry's quill pen proves that, doesn't it?"
"But I've never heard of Vera Fry's quill pen," said Anne patiently.
"Oh, haven't you? I thought I told you. I've told you so much. Vera's fiancé gave her a quill pen that he'd made out of a feather he'd picked up that had fallen from a crow's wing. He said to her, 'Let your spirit soar to heaven with it whenever you use it, like the bird who once bore it.' Wasn't that just wonderful? But Terry said the pen would wear out very soon, especially if Vera wrote as much as she talked, and anyway he didn't think crows ever soared to heaven. He just missed the meaning of the whole thing completely, its very essence."
"What was its meaning?"
"Oh, why, soaring. You know, getting away from the clods of earth. Did you notice Vera's ring? A sapphire. I think sapphires are too dark for engagement rings. I'd rather have your dear, romantic little hoop of pearls. Terry wanted to give me my ring right away, but I said not yet a while. It would seem like a fetter. So irrevocable, you know. I wouldn't have felt like that if I'd really loved him, would I?"
"No, I'm afraid not."
"It's been so wonderful to tell somebody what I really feel like. Oh, Miss Shirley, if I could only find myself free again, free to seek the deeper meaning of life. Terry wouldn't understand what I meant if I said that to him. And I know he has a temper all the Garlands have. Oh, Miss Shirley, if you would just talk to him, tell him what I feel like. He thinks you're wonderful. He'd be guided by what you say."
"Hazel, my dear little girl, how could I do that?"
"I don't see why not."
Hazel finished the last new moon and laid the orange-wood stick down tragically.
"If you can't, there isn't any help anywhere. But I can never marry Terry Garland."
"If you don't love Terry, you ought to go to him and tell him so, no matter how badly it will make him feel. Someday you'll meet someone you can really love, Hazel dear. You won't have any doubts then. You'll know."
"I shall never love anybody again,"
said Hazel, stonily calm.
"Love brings only sorrow. Young as I am, I have learned that. This would make a wonderful plot for one of your stories, wouldn't it, Miss Shirley? I must be going. I had no idea it was so late. I feel so much better since I confided in you. Touched your soul in Shadowland, as Shakespeare says."
"I think it was Pauline Johnson," said Anne gently.
"Well, I knew it was somebody who had lived. I think I shall sleep tonight, Miss Shirley. I've hardly slept since I found myself engaged to Terry without the least notion how it had all come about."
Hazel fluffed out her hair and put on her hat, a hat with a rosy lining to its brim and rosy blossoms around it. She looked so distractingly pretty in it that Anne kissed her impulsively. "You're the prettiest thing, darling," she said admiringly. Hazel stood very still. Then she lifted her eyes and stared clear through the ceiling of the tower room, clear through the attic above it, and sought the stars.
"I shall never forget this wonderful moment, Miss Shirley,"
she murmured rapturously.
"I feel that my beauty, if I have any, has been consecrated. Oh, Miss Shirley, you don't know how really terrible it is to have a reputation for beauty and to be always afraid that when people meet you they will not think you as pretty as you were reported to be. It's torture. Sometimes I just die of mortification because I fancy I can see they're disappointed. Perhaps it's only my imagination. I'm so imaginative. Too much so for my own good, I fear. I imagined I was in love with Terry, you see. Oh, Miss Shirley, can you smell the apple blossom fragrance?
Having a nose, Anne could.
Isn't it just divine? I hope heaven will be all flowers. One could be good if one lived in a lily, couldn't one?
I'm afraid it might be a little confining, said Anne perversely.
Oh, Miss Shirley, don't be sarcastic with your little adorer. Sarcasm just shrivels me up like a leaf.
I see she hasn't talked you quite to death,
said Rebecca Dew, when Anne had come back after seeing Hazel to the end of Spook's Lane.
I don't see how you put up with her.
I like her, Rebecca. I really do. I was a dreadful little chatterbox when I was a child. I wonder if I sounded as silly to the people who had to listen to me as Hazel does sometimes.
I didn't know you when you was a child, but I'm sure you didn't, said Rebecca, because you would mean what you said no matter how you expressed it. And Hazel Marr doesn't. She's nothing but skim milk pretending to be cream.
Oh, of course she dramatizes herself a bit, as most girls do, but I think she means some of the things she says, said Anne, thinking of Terry. Perhaps it was because she had a rather poor opinion of the said Terry that she believed Hazel was quite earnest in all she said about him. Anne thought Hazel was throwing herself away on Terry in spite of the 10,000 he was coming into. Anne considered Terry a good-looking, rather weak youth, who would fall in love with the first pretty girl who made eyes at him, and would, with equal facility, fall in love with the next one if number one turned him down or left him alone too long. Anne had seen a good deal of Terry that spring, for Hazel had insisted on her playing gooseberry frequently, and she was destined to see more of him, for Hazel went to visit friends in Kingsport, and during her absence Terry rather attached himself to Anne, taking her out for rides and seeing her home from places. They called each other Anne and Terry, for they were about the same age, although Anne felt quite motherly towards him. Terry felt immensely flattered that the clever Miss Shirley seemed to like his companionship, and he became so sentimental at the night of May Connolly's party in a moonlit garden where the shadows of the acacias blew crazily about, that Anne amusedly reminded him of the absent Hazel. "Oh, Hazel," said Terry, "that child." "You're engaged to that child, aren't you?" said Anne severely.
Not really engaged. Nothing but some boy and girl nonsense. I guess I was just swept off my feet by the moonlight.
Anne did a bit of rapid thinking. If Terry really cared so little for Hazel as this, the child was far better freed from him. Perhaps this was a heaven-sent opportunity to extricate them both from this silly tangle they had got themselves into, and from which neither of them, taking things with all the deadly seriousness of youth, knew how to escape.
"Of course,"
went on Terry, misinterpreting her silence,
"I'm in a bit of a predicament, I'll own. I'm afraid Hazel has taken me a little bit too seriously, and I just don't know the best way to open her eyes to her mistake."
Impulsive Anne assumed her most maternal look. "Terry, you are a couple of children playing at being grown up. Hazel doesn't really care anything more for you than you do for her. Apparently the moonlight affected both of you. She wants to be free, but is afraid to tell you so for fear of hurting your feelings. She's just a bewildered, romantic girl, and you're a boy in love with love, and someday you'll both have a good laugh at yourselves." "I think I put that very nicely," thought Anne complacently. Terry drew a long breath.
"You've taken a weight off my mind, Anne. Hazel's a sweet little thing, of course. I hate to think of hurting her, but I've realized our mistake for some weeks. When one meets a woman, the woman— You're not going in yet, Anne? Is all this good moonlight to be wasted? You look like a white rose in the moonlight, Anne—" But Anne had flown. Chapter 28.
Anne, correcting examination papers in the tower room one mid-June evening, paused to wipe her nose. She had wiped it so often that evening that it was rosy red and rather painful. The truth was that Anne was the victim of a very severe and very unromantic cold in the head. It would not allow her to enjoy the soft green sky behind the hemlocks of the evergreens, the silver-white moon hanging over the Storm King, the haunting perfume of the lilacs below her window, or the frosty blue-penciled irises in the vase on her table. It darkened all her past and overshadowed all her future. "A cold at the head in June is an immoral thing," she told Dusty Miller, who was meditating on the window-sill. "But in 2 weeks from today I'll be in dear Green Gables instead of stewing here over examination papers full of howlers and wiping a bored-out nose. Think of it, Dusty Miller." Apparently Dusty Miller thought of it. He may also have thought that the young lady who was hurrying up Spook's Lane and down the road and along the perennial path looked angry and disturbed and un-June-like. It was Hazel Marr, only a day back from Kingsport, and evidently a much disturbed Hazel Marr, who, a few minutes later, burst stormily into the tower room without waiting for a reply to her sharp knock. "Why, Hazel, dear, shoo! Are you back from Kingsport already? I didn't expect you until next week."
"No, I suppose you didn't," said Hazel sarcastically. "Yes, Miss Shirley, I am back. And what do I find? That you have been doing your best to lure Terry away from me, and all but succeeding."
"Hazel, shoo!"
"Oh, I know it all. You told Terry I didn't love him, that I wanted to break our engagement, our sacred engagement."
"Hazel, child, shoo!"
"Oh, yes, sneer at me, sneer at everything, but don't try to deny it. You did it, and you did it deliberately."
"Of course I did. You asked me to."
"I asked you to?"
"Here in this very room. You told me you didn't love him and could never marry him."
"Oh, just a mood, I suppose. I never dreamed you'd take me seriously. I thought you would understand the artistic temperament. Your age is older than I am, of course, but even you can't have forgotten the crazy ways girls talk, feel. You, who pretended to be my friend."
"This must be a nightmare," thought poor Anne, wiping her nose. "Sit down, Hazel, do."
"Sit down?"
Hazel flew wildly up and down the room.
"How can I sit down? How can anybody sit down when her life is in ruins all about her? Oh, if that is what being old does to you, jealous of younger people's happiness and determined to wreck it, I shall pray never to grow old."
Anne's hand suddenly tingled to box Hazel's ears with a strange, horrible, primitive tingle of desire. She slew it so instantly that she would never believe afterwards that she had really felt it, but she did think a little gentle chastisement was indicated.
"If you can't sit down and talk sensibly, Hazel, I wish you would go away." A very violent curfew. "I have work to do." Sniff, sniff, snuffle.
"Oh, I am not going away till I have told you just what I think of you. Oh, I know I've only myself to blame. I should have known. I did know. I felt instinctively the first time I saw you that you were dangerous. That red hair and those green eyes. But I never dreamed you'd go so far as to make trouble between me and Terry. I thought you were a Christian, at least. I never heard of anyone doing such a thing. Well, you've broken my heart, if that is any satisfaction to you."
"You little goose."
"I won't talk to you. Oh, Terry and I were so happy before you spoiled everything. I was so happy. The first girl of my set to be engaged. I even had my wedding all planned out. 4 bridesmaids in lovely pale blue silk dresses with black velvet ribbon on the flounces. So chic. Oh, I don't know if I hate you the most or pity you the most. How could you treat me like this, after I've loved you so? trusted you so, believed in you so."
Hazel's voice broke. Her eyes filled with tears. She collapsed on a rocking chair. "You can't have many exclamation points left," thought Anne, but no doubt the supply of italics is inexhaustible.
"This will just about kill poor Mama," sobbed Hazel. "She was so pleased. Everybody was so pleased. They all thought it an ideal match. Oh, can anything ever again be like it used to be?"
"Wait till the next moonlight night and try," said Anne gently.
"Oh, yes, laugh, Miss Shirley, laugh at my suffering. I have not the least doubt that you find it all very amusing indeed. You don't know what suffering is. It is terrible, terrible."
Anne looked at the clock and sneezed. "Then don't suffer," she said unpityingly.
"I will suffer. My feelings are very deep. Of course, a shallow soul wouldn't suffer, but I am thankful I am not shallow, whatever else I am. Have you any idea what it means to be in love, Miss Shirley? Really, terribly, deeply, wonderfully in love, and then to trust and be deceived. I went to Kingsport so happy, loving all the world. I told Terry to be good to you while I was away, not to let you be lonesome. I came home last night so happy, and he told me he didn't love me any longer, that it was all a mistake, and that you had told him I didn't care for him any longer and wanted to be free."
"My intentions were honorable," said Anne, laughing. Her impish sense of humor had come to her rescue, and she was laughing as much at herself as at Hazel.
"Oh, how did I live through the night?" said Hazel wildly. "I just walked the floor, and you don't know, you can't even imagine what I've gone through today. I've had to sit and listen, actually listen, to people talking about Terry's infatuation for you. Oh, people have been watching you. They know what you've been doing. And why? Why? That is what I cannot understand. You had your own lover. Why couldn't you have left me mine? What had you against me? What had I ever done to you?"
"I think," said Anne, thoroughly exasperated, "that you and Terry both need a good spanking, if you weren't too angry to listen to reason."
"Oh, I'm not angry, Miss Shirley, only hurt, terribly hurt,"
said Hazel, in a voice positively foggy with tears.
"I feel that I have been betrayed in everything, in friendship as well as in love. Well, they say after your heart is broken, you never suffer any more. I hope it's true, but I fear it isn't."
"What has become of your ambition, Hazel? And what about the billionaire patient and the honeymoon villa on the blue Mediterranean?"
"I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Miss Shirley. I'm not a bit ambitious. I'm not one of those dreadful new women. My highest ambition was to be a happy wife and make a happy home for my husband. Was. To think it should be in the past tense. Well, it doesn't do to trust anyone. I've learned that. A bitter, bitter lesson."
Hazel wiped her eyes, and Anne wiped her nose, and Dusty Miller glared at the evening star with the expression of a misanthrope. "You'd better go, I think, Hazel. I'm really very busy, and I can't see that there is anything to be gained by prolonging this interview." Hazel walked to the door with the air of Mary, Queen of Scots, advancing to the scaffold, and turned there dramatically.
"Farewell, Miss Shirley. I leave you to your conscience."
Anne, left alone with her conscience, laid down her pen, sneezed 3 times, and gave herself a plain talking to. "You may be a B.A., Anne Shirley, but you have a few things to learn yet. Things that even Rebecca Dew could have told you, did tell you. Be honest with yourself, my dear girl, and take your medicine like a gallant lady. Admit you were carried off your feet by flattery. Admit that you really liked Hazel's professed adoration for you. Admit you found it pleasant to be worshipped. Admit that you liked the idea of being a sort of dea ex machina, saving people from their own folly when they didn't in the least want to be saved from it. And having admitted all this and feeling wiser and sadder and a few thousand years older, pick up your pen and proceed with your examination papers, pausing to note in passing that Myra Pringle thinks a seraph is an animal that abound in Africa. Chapter 29. A week later, a letter came for Anne, written on pale blue paper, edged with silver.
Dear Miss Shirley, I'm writing this to tell you that all misunderstanding is cleared away between Terry and me, and we are so deeply, intensely, wonderfully happy that we have decided we can forgive you. Terry says he was just moonlighted into making love to you, but that his heart never really swerved in its allegiance to me. He says he really likes sweet, simple girls, that all men do, and has no use for intriguing, designing ones. We don't understand why you behaved to us as you did. We will never understand. Perhaps you just wanted material for a story, and thought you could find it in tampering with the first sweet, tremulous love of a girl. But we thank you for revealing us to ourselves. Terry says he had never realized the deeper meaning of love before, so really it was all for the best. We are so sympathetic. We can feel each other's thoughts. Nobody understands him but me, and I want to be a source of inspiration to him forever. I am not clever like you, but I feel I can be that, for we are soulmates and have vowed eternal truth and constancy to each other, no matter how many jealous people and false friends may try to make trouble between us. We are going to be married as soon as I have my trousseau ready. I'm going up to Boston to get it. There really isn't anything in Summerside. My dress is to be white moire, and my traveling suit will be dove gray with hat, gloves, and blouse of delphinium blue. Of course, I'm very young, but I want to be married when I am young, before the bloom goes off life. Terry is all that my wildest dreams could picture, and every thought of my heart is for him alone. I know we're going to be rapturously happy. Once, I believed all my friends would rejoice with me in my happiness, but I have learned a bitter lesson in worldly wisdom since then. Yours truly, Hazel Marr. P.S. 1. You told me Terry had such a temper. Why, he's a perfect lamb, his sister says. H.M. P.S. 2. I've heard that lemon juice will bleach freckles. You might try it on your nose. H.M. To quote Rebecca Dew, remarked Anne to Dusty Miller, postscript number 2 is the last straw. Chapter 30. Anne went home for her second Summerside vacation with mixed feelings. Gilbert was not to be in Avonlea that summer. He had gone west to work on a new railroad that was being built. But Green Gables was still Green Gables, and Avonlea was still Avonlea. The lake of shining waters shone and sparkled as of old. The ferns still grew as thickly over the Dryad's bubble, and the log bridge, though it was a little crumblier and mossier every year, still led up the shadows and silences and wind songs of the haunted wood. And Anne had prevailed on Mrs. Campbell to let little Elizabeth go home with her for a fortnight, no more. But Elizabeth, looking forward to 2 whole weeks with Miss Shirley, asked no more of life. I feel like Miss Elizabeth today, she told Anne with a sigh of delightful excitement as they drove away from windy Poplars. Will you please call me Miss Elizabeth when you introduce me to your friends at Green Gables? It would make me feel so grown up."
"I will," promised Anne gravely, remembering a small red-headed damsel who had once begged to be called Cordelia. Elizabeth's drive from Blight River to Green Gables, over a road which only Prince Edward Island in June can show, was almost as ecstatic a thing for her as it had been for Anne that memorable spring evening so many years ago. The world was beautiful, with wind-rippled meadows on every hand and surprises lurking around every corner. She was with her beloved Miss Shirley. She would be free from the woman for 2 whole weeks. She had a new pink gingham dress and a pair of lovely new brown boots. It was almost as if tomorrow were already there, with 14 tomorrows to follow. Elizabeth's eyes were shining with dreams when they turned into the Green Gables lane, where the wild pink roses grew. Things seemed to change magically for Elizabeth the moment she got to Green Gables. For 2 weeks she lived in a world of romance. You couldn't step outside the door without stepping into something romantic. Things were just bound to happen in Avonlea. If not today, then tomorrow. Elizabeth knew she hadn't quite got into tomorrow yet, but she knew she was on the very fringes of it. Everything in and about Green Gables seemed to be acquainted with her. Even Marilla's pink rosebud tea set was like an old friend. The rooms looked at her as if she had always known and loved them. The very grass was greener than grass anywhere else, and the people who lived at Green Gables were the kind of people who lived in tomorrow. She loved them and was beloved by them. Davy and Dora adored her and spoiled her. Marilla and Mrs. Lynde approved of her. She was neat, she was ladylike, she was polite to her elders. They knew Anne did not like Mrs. Campbell's methods, but it was plain to be seen that she had trained her great-granddaughter properly.
"Oh, I don't want to sleep, Miss Shirley,"
Elizabeth whispered when they were in bed in the little porch gable after a rapturous evening.
"I don't want to sleep away a single minute at these wonderful 2 weeks. I wish I could get along without any sleep while I'm here."
For a while she didn't sleep. It was heavenly to lie there and listen to the splendid low thunder Miss Shirley had told her was the sound of the sea. Elizabeth loved it, and the sigh of the wind around the eaves as well. Elizabeth had always been afraid of the night. Who knew what queer thing might jump at you out of it? But now she was afraid no longer. For the first time in her life, the night seemed like a friend to her. They would go to the shore tomorrow, Miss Shirley had promised, and have a dip in those silver-tipped waves they had seen breaking beyond the green dunes of Avonlea when they drove over the last hill. Elizabeth could see them coming in one after the other. One of them was a great dark wave of sleep. It rolled right over her. Elizabeth drowned in it with a delicious sigh of surrender.
"It's so easy to love God here,"
was her last conscious thought. But she lay awake for a while every night of her stay at Green Gables, long after Miss Shirley had gone to sleep, thinking over things. Why couldn't life at the Evergreens be like life at Green Gables? Elizabeth had never lived where she could make a noise if she wanted to. Everybody at the Evergreens had to move softly, speak softly, even, so Elizabeth felt, think softly. There were times when Elizabeth desired perversely to yell loud and long. "You may make all the noise you want to here," Anne had told her. But it was strange. She no longer wanted to yell now that there was nothing to prevent her. She liked to go quietly, stepping gently among all the lovely things around her. But Elizabeth learned to laugh during that sojourn at Green Gables, and when she went back to Summerside she carried delightful memories with her and left equally delightful ones behind her. To the Green Gables folks, Green Gables seemed for months full of memories of little Elizabeth. For little Elizabeth she was to them, in spite of the fact that Anne had solemnly introduced her as Miss Elizabeth. She was so tiny, so golden, so elf-like, that they couldn't think of her as anything but little Elizabeth. Little Elizabeth dancing in a twilight garden among the white June lilies, coiled up on a bough of the big Duchess apple tree reading fairy tales, unlet and unhindered. Little Elizabeth half drowned in a field of buttercups, where her golden head seemed just a larger buttercup, chasing silver-green moths, or trying to count the fireflies in Lover's Lane, listening to the bumblebees zooming in the Canterbury bells, being fed strawberries and cream by Dora in the pantry, or eating red currants with her in the yard.
Red currants are such beautiful things, aren't they, Dora? It's just like eating jewels, isn't it?
Little Elizabeth singing to herself in the haunted dusk of the firs, with fingers sweet from gathering the big fat pink cabbage roses, gazing at the great moon hanging over the brook valley.
I think the moon has worried eyes. Don't you, Mrs. Lind?
Crying bitterly because a chapter in the serial story in Davy's magazine left the hero in a sad predicament.
Oh, Miss Shirley, I'm sure he can never live through it.
And little Elizabeth curled up all flushed and sweet like a wild rose for an afternoon nap on the kitchen sofa, with Dora's kittens cuddled about her, shrieking with laughter to see the wind blowing the dignified old hens' tails over their backs. Could it be little Elizabeth laughing like that, helping Anne frost cupcakes, Mrs. Lind cut the patches for the new double Irish chain quilt, and Dora rubbed the old brass candlesticks till they could see their faces in them, cutting out tiny biscuits with a thimble under Marilla's tutelage? Why, the Green Gables folks could hardly look at a place or thing without being reminded of little Elizabeth.
I wonder if I'll ever have such a happy fortnight again,
thought little Elizabeth as she drove away from Green Gables. The road to the station was just as beautiful as it had been 2 weeks before, but half the time little Elizabeth couldn't see it for tears. "I couldn't have believed I'd miss a child so much," said Mrs. Lind. When little Elizabeth went, Catherine Brooke and her dog came for the rest of the summer. Catherine had resigned from the staff of the high school at the close of the year and meant to go to Redmond in the fall to take a secretarial course at Redmond University. Anne had advised this.
"I know you'd like it, and you've never liked teaching,"
said the latter as they sat one evening in a ferny corner of a clover field and watched the glories of a sunset sky. "Life owes me something more than it has paid me, and I'm going out to collect it," said Catherine decidedly. "I feel so much younger than I did this time last year," she added with a laugh.
"I'm sure it's the best thing for you to do, but I hate to think of Summerside and the High without you. What will the Tower Room be like next year without our evenings of confab and argument, and our hours of foolishness when we turned everybody and everything into a joke?"
The Third Year. Chapter 31. Windy Poplars, Spooks Lane, September 8th. Dearest, the summer is over, the summer in which I have seen you only that weekend in May, and I am back at Windy Poplars for my third and last year at Summerside High. Catherine and I had a delightful time together at Green Gables, and I'm going to miss her dreadfully this year. The new junior teacher is a jolly little personage, chubby and rosy and friendly as a puppy, but somehow there's nothing more to her than that. She has sparkling, shallow blue eyes with no thought behind them. I like her, I'll always like her, neither more nor less. There's nothing to discover in her. There was so much to discover in Catherine when you once got past her guard. There is no change at Windy Poplars. Yes, there is. The old red cow has gone to her long home, so Rebecca Dew sadly informed me when I came down to supper Monday night. The widows have decided not to bother with another one, but to get milk and cream from Mr. Cherry. This means that little Elizabeth will come no more to the garden gate for her new milk. But Mrs. Campbell seems to have grown reconciled to her coming over here when she wants to, so that does not make so much difference now. And another change is brewing. Aunt Kate told me, much to my sorrow, that they have decided to give Dusty Miller away as soon as they can find a suitable home for him. When I protested, they said they were really driven to it for peace's sake. Rebecca Dew has been constantly complaining about him all summer, and there seems to be no other way of satisfying her. Poor Dusty Miller. He is such a nice, prowly, purry darling. Tomorrow, being Saturday, I'm going to look after Mrs. Raymond's twins while she goes to Charlottetown to the funeral of some relative. Mrs. Raymond is a widow who came to our town last winter. Summerside is a great place for widows. Rebecca Dew and the Windy Poplars widows think her a little too grand for Summerside, really, but she was really a wonderful help to Catherine and me in our dramatic club activities. One good turn deserves another. Gerald and Geraldine are 8 and are a pair of angelic-looking youngsters, but Rebecca Dew pulled a mouth, to use one of her own expressions, when I told her what I was going to do. But I love children, Rebecca.
Children, yes, but them's holy terrors, Miss Shirley. Miss Raymond doesn't believe in punishing children no matter what they do. She says she's determined they'll have a natural life. They take people in by that saintly look of theirs, but I've heard what her neighbors have to say of them. The minister's wife called one afternoon. Well, Mrs. Raymond was sweet as sugar pie to her, but when she was leaving, a shower of Spanish onions came flying down the stairs, and one of them knocked her hat off. Children always behave so abominably when you specially want 'em to be good, was all Mrs. Raymond said, kinder as if she was rather proud of them being so unmanageable. They're from the States, you know. As if that explained everything. Rebecca has about as much use for Yankees as Mrs. Lynde has. Chapter 32. Saturday forenoon, Anne betook herself to the pretty old-fashioned cottage on a street that straggled out into the country, where Mrs. Raymond and her famous twins lived. Mrs. Raymond was all ready to depart, rather gaily dressed for a funeral, perhaps, especially with regard to the beflowered hat perched on top of the smooth brown waves of hair that flowed around her head, but looking very beautiful. The 8-year-old twins, who had inherited her beauty, were sitting on the stairs, their delicate faces wreathed with a quite cherubic expression. They had complexions of pink and white, large china blue eyes, and aureoles of fine, fluffy, pale yellow hair. They smiled with engaging sweetness when their mother introduced them to Anne, and told them that dear Miss Shirley had been so kind as to come and take care of them while Mother was away at dear Auntie Ella's funeral. And of course they would be good and not give her one teeny-weeny bit of trouble, wouldn't they, darlings? The darlings nodded gravely and contrived, though it hadn't seemed possible, to look more angelic than ever. Mrs. Raymond took Anne down the walk to the gate with her. "They're all I've got now," she said pathetically. "Perhaps I may have spoiled them a little. I know people say I have. People always know so much better how you ought to bring up your children than you know yourself. Haven't you noticed, Miss Shirley? But I think loving is better than spanking any day. Don't you, Miss Shirley? I'm sure you will have no trouble with them. Children always know whom they can play on and whom they can't, don't you think? That poor old Miss Prouty up the street. I had her stay with them one day, but the poor darlings couldn't bear her, so of course they teased her a good bit. You know what children are. She has revenged herself by telling the most ridiculous tales about them all over town. But they'll just love you, and I know they'll be angels. Of course, they have high spirits, but children should have, don't you think? It's so pitiful to see children with a cowed appearance, isn't it? I like them to be natural, don't you? Too good children don't seem natural, do they? Don't let them sail their boats in the bathtub or go wading in the pond, will you? I'm so afraid of them catching cold. Their father died of pneumonia." Mrs. Raymond's large blue eyes looked as if they were going to overflow, but she gallantly blinked the tears away. "Don't worry if they quarrel a little. Children always do quarrel, don't you think? But if any outsider attacks them, my dear, they really just worship each other, you know. I could have taken one of them to the funeral, but they simply wouldn't hear of it. They've never been separated a day in their lives, and I couldn't look after twins at a funeral, could I now?" "Don't worry, Mrs. Raymond," said Anne kindly. "I'm sure Gerald and Geraldine and I will have a beautiful day together. I love children."
I know it. I felt sure the minute I saw you that you love children. One can always tell, don't you think? There's something about a person who loves children. Poor old Miss Prouty detests them. She looks for the worst in children, and so, of course, she finds them. You can't conceive what a comfort it is to me to reflect that my darlings are under the care of one who loves and understands children. I'm sure I'll quite enjoy the day. You might take us to the funeral, shrieked Gerald, suddenly sticking his head out of an upstairs window. We never have any fun like that. Oh, they're in the bathroom, exclaimed Mrs. Richmond tragically. Dear Miss Shirley, please go and take them out. Gerald, darling, you know Mother couldn't take you both to the funeral. Oh, Miss Shirley, he's got that coyote skin from the parlor floor tied round his neck by the paws again. He'll ruin it. Please make him take it off at once. I must hurry or I'll miss the train. Mrs. Raymond sailed elegantly away, and Anne ran upstairs to find the angelic Geraldine had grasped her brother by the legs and was apparently trying to hurl him bodily out of the window. Miss Shirley, make Gerald stop putting his tongue out at me, she demanded fiercely. Does it hurt you? Asked Anne smilingly. Well, he's not going to put his tongue out at me, retorted Geraldine, darting a baleful look at Gerald, who returned it with interest. My tongue's my own, and you can't stop me from putting it out when I like, can she, Miss Shirley? Anne ignored the question. Twins, dear, it's just an hour till lunchtime. Shall we go and sit in the garden and play games and tell stories? And, Gerald, won't you put that coyote skin back on the floor? But I want to play wolf, said Gerald. He wants to play wolf, cried Geraldine, suddenly aligning herself on her brother's side. We want to play wolf, they both cried together. A peal from the doorbell cut the knot of Anne's dilemma. Come on and see who it is, cried Geraldine. They flew to the stairs, and by reason of sliding down the banisters got to the front door much quicker than Anne, the coyote skin coming unloosed and drifting away in the process. We never buy anything from peddlers, Gerald told the lady standing on the doorstone. Can I see your mother? Asked the caller. No, you can't. Mother's gone to Aunt Ella's funeral. Miss Shirley's looking after us. That's her coming down the stairs. She'll make you scat. Anne did feel rather like making the caller scat when she saw who it was. Miss Pamela Drake was not a popular caller in Summerside. She was always canvassing for something, and it was generally quite impossible to get rid of her unless you bought it, since she was utterly impervious to snubs and hints, and had apparently all the time in the world at her command. This time she was taking orders for an encyclopedia, something no schoolteacher could afford to be without. Vainly, Anne protested that she did not need an encyclopedia. The high school already possessed a very good one. 10 years out of date, said Miss Pamela firmly. We'll just sit down here on this rustic bench, Miss Shirley, and I'll show you my prospectus. I'm afraid I haven't time, Miss Drake. I have the children to look after. It won't take but a few minutes. I've been meaning to call on you, Miss Shirley, and I call it real fortunate to find you here. Run away and play, children, while Miss Shirley and I skim over this beautiful prospectus. Mother's hired Miss Shirley to look after us, said Geraldine, with a toss of her aerial curls. But Gerald had tugged her backward, and they slammed the door shut. You see, Miss Shirley, what this encyclopedia means. Look at the beautiful paper. Feel it. The splendid engravings. No other encyclopedia on the market has half the number of engravings. The wonderful print, a blind man could read it, and all for $80, $8 down and $8 a month till it's all paid. You'll never have such another chance. We're just doing this to introduce it. Next year it will be $120. But I don't want an encyclopedia, Miss Drake, said Anne desperately. Of course you want an encyclopedia. Everyone wants an encyclopedia, a national encyclopedia. I don't know how I lived before I became acquainted with the National Encyclopedia. Live? I didn't live. I merely existed. Look at that engraving of the cassowary, Miss Shirley. Did you ever really see a cassowary before? But, Miss Drake, if you think the term's a little too onerous, I feel sure I can make a special arrangement for you, being a school teacher. $6 a month instead of $8. You simply can't refuse an offer like that, Miss Shirley. Anne almost felt she couldn't. Wouldn't it be worth $6 a month to get rid of this terrible woman?
who had so evidently made up her mind not to go until she had got an order. Besides, what were the twins doing? They were alarmingly quiet. Suppose they were sailing their boats in the bathtub, or had sneaked out of the back door and gone wading in the pond. She made one more pitiful effort to escape.
"I'll think this over, Miss Drake, and let you know."
"There's no time like the present," said Miss Drake, briskly getting out her fountain pen. "You know you're going to take the National, so you might just as well sign for it now as any other time. Nothing is ever gained by putting things off. The price may go up at any moment, and then you'd have to pay $120. Sign here, Miss Shirley." Anne felt the fountain pen being forced into her hand. Another moment, and then there was such a blood-curdling shriek from Miss Drake that Anne dropped the fountain pen under the clump of golden glow that flanked the rustic seat, and gazed in amazed horror at her companion. Was that Miss Drake? That indescribable object? Hatless, spectacleless, almost hairless? Hat, spectacles, false front were floating in the air above her head halfway up to the bathroom window, out of which two golden heads were hanging. Gerald was grasping a fishing rod, to which were tied two cords ending in fish hooks. By what magic he had contrived to make a triple catch, only he could have told. Probably it was sheer luck. Anne flew into the house and upstairs. By the time she reached the bathroom, the twins had fled. Gerald had dropped the fishing rod, and a peep from the window revealed a furious Miss Drake retrieving her belongings, including the fountain pen, and marching to the gate. For once in her life, Miss Pamela Drake had failed to land her order. Anne discovered the twins seraphically eating apples on the back porch. It was hard to know what to do. Certainly such behavior could not be allowed to pass without a rebuke, but Gerald had undoubtedly rescued her from a difficult position, and Miss Drake was an odious creature who needed a lesson. Still—
"You had a great big worm!"
shrieked Gerald.
"I saw it disappear down your throat."
Geraldine laid down her apple and promptly turned sick, very sick. Anne had her hands full for some time. And when Geraldine was better, it was lunch hour, and Anne suddenly decided to let Gerald off with a very mild reproof. After all, no lasting harm had been done Miss Drake, who would probably hold her tongue religiously about the incident for her own sake. "Do you think, Gerald," she asked gently, "that what you did was a gentlemanly action?"
"Nope,"
said Gerald.
"but it was good fun. Gee, I'm some fisherman, ain't I?"
The lunch was excellent. Mrs. Raymond had prepared it before she left, and whatever her shortcomings as a disciplinarian might be, she was a good cook. Gerald and Geraldine, being occupied with gorging, did not quarrel or display worse table manners than the general run of children. After lunch, Anne washed the dishes, getting Geraldine to help dry them, and Gerald to put them carefully away in the cupboard. They were both quite knacky at it, and Anne reflected complacently that all they needed was wise training and a little firmness. Chapter 33. At 2:00, Mr. James Grand called. Mr. Grand was the chairman of the High School Board of Trustees, and had matters of importance to talk of, which he wished to discuss fully before he left on Monday to attend an educational conference in Kingsport. Could he come to Windy Poplars in the evening? Asked Anne. Unfortunately, he couldn't. Mr. Grand was a good sort of man in his own fashion, but Anne had long ago found out that he must be handled with gloves. Moreover, Anne was very anxious to get him on her side in a battle royal over new equipment that was looming up. She went out to the twins. "Darlings, will you play nicely out in the backyard while I have a little talk with Mr. Grand? I won't be very long, and then we'll have an afternoon tea picnic on the banks of the pond. I'll teach you to blow soap bubbles with red dye in them, the loveliest things."
"Will you give us a quarter apiece if we behave?"
demanded Gerald. "No, Gerald, dear," said Anne firmly. "I'm not going to bribe you. I know you're going to be good just because I ask you as a gentleman should."
"We'll be good, Miss Shirley,"
promised Gerald solemnly.
"Awful good.
echoed Geraldine with equal solemnity. It is possible they would have kept their promise if Ivy Trent had not arrived home almost as soon as Anne was closeted with Mr. Grand in the parlor. But Ivy Trent did arrive, and the Raymond twins hated Ivy Trent, the impeccable Ivy Trent who never did anything wrong and always looked as if